Right on. Hey everybody, thanks for coming out here today, and I'm really excited about this conference. You know, we were just talking about this. It was funny. Ken was like, "You have 30 minutes, and then we take the microphone away, and there will be discussion." And you're like, "Okay, all right, we can do this." So I'm excited for it, and hopefully some of the stuff we talk about will give you some framework of like what we can discuss, how some things that are helpful inside of your organizations, where you're at. Who am I? I do security and DevRel over at Verica. I have some experience, or I've been working on doing the DevOps Days Austin conference since 2012, so we've been enjoying that. And that usually happens in May, so if you're ever in Austin, come check that out. And this year we did our first DevSecOps Days Austin conference, and that was a lot of fun. And so I think we're probably going to do that again. We did it in December this last year, and that was a little bit painful with Thanksgiving and Christmas and stuff, so we may change the time on it. But I'm also a LinkedIn Learning author, so if any of these topics interest you, I have some links later in the deck. They'll provide you with links to be able to look at those, and then you can find me at wickett.me. But anyways, this is one of my favorite O'Reilly books, and I excel at this one, and you know, but I thought the deck was good enough to ship, and I thought I'd go ahead and just provide the slides to y'all. So if you want the slides, you can just like check out for the next 30 minutes and then check back in at the 20-minute discussion thing. But my out-of-office responder should email you. And you're not going to like get signed up to an email list or anything like that. It's like in your email. I always like the tweets fly by, and I'm like, where was that thing that I was looking for? So anyways, now we should talk about security, I think, and that's really important and why we're all here. And I think it's helpful to look at, there's two quotes that I always like to look at whenever I think of security. And the first is Steve Belovin's quote. Now Steve, he wrote the book on firewalls in the late 90s, and just a few years ago released this book, Thinking Security. And it's like, this book is to security practitioners from a security practitioner. And he says, companies are spending a great deal on security, but we still read of all these massive computer-related attacks. Clearly, something is wrong. The root of the problem is twofold. We're protecting the wrong things, and we're hurting productivity in the process. And do you feel the weight of that? I see some heads nodding, right? Like that's the place where security feels that they are, and I think that they are in many organizations. And that is also the place where a lot of operations felt that they were, 10 years ago plus, right? So now there's this DevOps thing, and we'll talk about DevSecOps and how that brought us, but I find that to be really interesting. The next one is Michael Zalewski. He has this book called The Tangled Web. It's about browser and web application security, but the first chapter kind of walks you through the history of computing and how security kind of played in that space in those early days. And he has this quote when you get to the 90s, and he says, "Security by risk assessment introduces a dangerous fallacy that structured inadequacy is almost as good as adequacy, and that underfunded security efforts plus risk management are about as good as properly funded security work." So has anybody ever been in those meetings where it's like, oh yeah, we'll accept the risk, or there's like this like insurance policy situation where you're thinking of how to deal with it, or you filled out the compliance checkbox so you're good, and I don't know, and I noticed that in like organizations where I was working. I worked at startups in my most recent career, but I started out early days in large enterprises, and you'd have a lot of like managers like, well, we'll accept that risk or whatever, and so then therefore you're free to push whatever you want. And then the inverse of this, you have the Agile Application Security book that says many security teams work with a worldview where their goal is to inhibit change as much as possible. Does that resonate with anybody? Yeah. Okay. Good. Okay. Yeah. Geez. All right. So. But there's other problems going around in our industry as well. So my friend Wendy posted this just yesterday, or a couple days ago. Said, "Okay, InfoSec friends, we've got to get on the same page. How do we say CISO?" And she says it's pronounced scapegoat, and that's often how CISOs move around jobs a lot. So, well, and then developers they usually will kind of read this book, right? And I'm often reminded of of this quote from Patrick, who, this is back like early days in 2000, 12, I think, or 2013, where he says culture is the most important aspect to DevOps succeeding in the enterprise. And a lot of times when we think about the enterprise, like security is kind of that big thing that we think about as like the differentiator between what we're doing in startups or what we're doing in other types of places. So, okay, so what is this thing, DevSecOps? And I know not everybody may love the name. I think, are we past that now? Not as many heads nodding on that one. Still some question, right? We're past it, says Paul, so that's good. What do we see happening at places that are doing DevOps and security and doing it together in high-performing organizations? So this is from the 2019 DevSecOps community survey. It says, what point in the pipeline are people putting in these, doing some automated security testing? And so the blue one here is the 2019, they're the elite DevOps practices according to the survey. But the idea is like just way above and beyond, they're outperforming their peers in this scenario where they are actually putting these things into place. So this could be kind of a pipeline, and we'll kind of walk through that. But what are they putting in that pipeline? What are they doing, right? So that's also very interesting. Web application firewalls, like that is, it's coming on like 20-year-old technology pretty soon here. Looks like they implement those, but not at a greater clip, right? I mean, like somewhat better, but not that much. You do have container and application security, which is kind of a questionable category at some points, and it is like a bit of a newer space. So you could see where that would have a higher adoption from like, faster companies that are using more DevOps practices. Open source governance has kind of been around for a while. SAST, same thing as WAF. It's 20 years aging. DAST came along at the same time as WAF. So these are not like security categories of things that are like markedly different than what we were doing 10 years ago, what we were doing 15 years ago. The difference is, is where they're putting it. Like they're actually considering it as part of their pipeline, they're considering it as part of the flow, and how they're actually delivering software. So I think we see DevSecOps as a cultural movement that furthers the movements of Agile and DevOps into security and kind of bringing those same tooling, same pieces, maybe breaking up in different ways, and we're going to talk through what that looks like. So I'd like to go through a security tool chain for CI and CD. We're going to go through different pieces. We'll talk a little bit about tools. We'll talk about questions you should ask and other things. And this idea came to me as I started seeing presentations much like this one, where it would have kind of a pipeline laid out with all the different tools that people would use. And if you want like the massive dictionary of all tools that ever have been made that could ever possibly be used, this SANS has a big poster size thing. What'd you say? Oh yeah, that's right, yeah. Well, there's a link in here, so if you get the slides, you can get it, but I don't know, does anybody get SANS mailing catalogs or whatever? Yeah, okay, a couple. They send out the posters, and every now and then you're like, wow, I got a poster, like, this is great, So if you're lucky enough, like maybe you can get the physical version, but I saw my friend Shannon Leitz's talk. She has the Secure Software Supply Chain talk that she was doing. And she breaks it up into different stages, but then also the questions that she likes to ask the teams along the way as they participate in the stages. And so I want to incorporate some of that in the way that we think about it. And that we think about security not as a gating process, or like we want to make sure that we're allowing people to come in. So, okay, so we're going to break it up into 5 stages. I'm going to talk about each stage independently and some ideas of things you can do, some tools you can apply there, and hopefully that'll be it. How are we doing? Are we ready for that? Are we thinking about the sandwiches for lunch? I don't really know if it's sandwiches, but I'm hoping. Okay. And that's about my comedy level, so I'm sorry. You picked the wrong talk. So the design and development of an application and its features includes all the practices like version control, sprint planning, unit testing. So what are the security activities you do here? Things like threat modeling, security stories, creating development standards together as a team, being able to do peer review, even things like static code analysis fits in there. So if you're looking at threat modeling and security stories, so there is like the threat modeling book the ShowStack has, there's OWASP has the application security threat modeling cheat sheet. There's ways to do evil user stories. There's one that I haven't checked out yet that I was pretty interested in. It's this very cute dragon here, but it's threatdragon.org, which is affiliated with OWASP, but haven't checked out. If anybody has experience with that, I'd be really curious of it. The one that I like the most is the Mozilla Rapid Risk Assessment, because it breaks up your threat modeling. Instead of doing it all in like one chunk, you're doing 30 minutes per sprint. You're applying the learnings, and over time, you kind of build up your threat model as you go. And it makes it part of the story as you're building it. So also building up development standards, so like have pre-commit hooks that you're doing for security, making sure you do peer review. I have single mainline branch, but I don't want to go after that one here because I think most people would agree, and if not, that's okay too. But I find like just hygiene is a really good thing for code, and security will sometimes not really like approach this from this standpoint. So this is one aspect if you're not purely in security, where you can sort of bring security into this and say, hey, like I have this like this linter that helps us clean things up. Here's some that you can use for Go. Of course, that's Go specific. Whatever language you're in, you would want to pick up. But I found that even doing like Go development, I was like, oh, this Go thumped. If you got to say it that way here. So, anyways, but it keeps all the code looking similar. So now whenever I look at your code versus my code, like it's a lot easier for us to diff. And so then now when that gets version controlled and checked in, like I don't have to guess kind of how it's structured. So I found even small things like that to be really helpful for teams as we're building this out. Of course, keeping all of our secrets out of our code base is an important thing. So keep using Git secrets or Git hound. Those are two popular ones. Talisman or Repo Supervisor are two other ones that are popular to use as well. And this all kind of comes down into this like philosophy where we have to say a bug is a bug is a bug. And so we can sort of think in like security vulnerabilities and high, medium, low and risk assessments, but like those are just bugs that are actually exploitable. And not all bugs are, but so just practicing like good hygiene, being able to participate where like error testing and other sort of linting type tools are, like that's a really helpful thing. But also be able to move into the IDE, into your local build environment, and also in the CI system. So my favorite IDE here. You can do static code analysis. And this is not a really unfamiliar area for a lot of folks. We've been doing this for 20 years, right? But static application security testing, a lot of them nowadays will ship with IDE plugins, and that's really helpful. Open source tools range from like Brakeman to like find security bugs. Also Brakeman Pro, Veracode, Fortify, and there's a ton of others that are like our paid solutions. And whenever I started putting some of this reference stuff together about a year and a half ago, it was, I put this on Twitter, and I got a lot of like hate mail out of this, if you consider hate mail. Like I don't actually get very much hate mail on a regular basis, so just like any was kind of surprising, but like this is like what I thought would be the most boring thing you could post, but I was like, hey, what am I missing, right? And it's like, then there's like this long diatribes between people on my feed that are like security pros that like, hate certain things or, are really, really into this. So tread lightly here. The big problem with all these tools is that they can like generate lots and lots of output for developers. They're not really finding real problems inside of your system because they just like the way that they do their testing, and they're disconnected from that. So you can't just like run the report and say, oh, hey, here you go. Let's have that set up to where now we can fix it. But instead, having security sort of take that output, massage it, look at it, figure it out, or a lot of these will let you kind of get more discrete on like the kind of stuff you're testing for. And as you'll see later in the talk, like we have a lot of the security tooling is built that way. Like it was built in an era that was previous where you're like meant to like sit in front of it, run it, and then like mentally kind of go through all the output and manually do that. And now we're seeing a change where now you have to just split all that sort of stuff up. So the next piece is like unit testing. So doing unit testing because that's what developers really care about. I really enjoyed the testing talk right before this. I feel like testers where they kind of what Lisa was saying, where they would put a tester on each individual team, or like have a tester like be a advocate for the team. I think that's a really helpful model. Security finds that same thing where they're able to find like security champions or security advocates inside of those teams. But TDD, BDD, whatever it is you're going after, there's some ideas for that. I think that's maybe not as relevant for this crowd, but what are some questions that we can ask at the development stage? So are the developers testing for security locally before it gets into the CI system? Are they hooked in their IDE? Are they able to run kind of a light version of the CI system on their local laptop? Are we treating all bugs equally or security bugs equally? So we can say we're looking for good hygiene practices, we're looking for good coding practices, and of course we want to stop any secrets from getting leaked into to the environment. Okay, so let's see. Just trying to do some math to make sure I don't run over on my time. So I'm going to maybe pick up the pace a little bit here. Well, the next step is inherit. Inherit is all the stuff that gets sucked into your system that you don't really know it should be there. I wanted to call this out as a specific step because a lot of times we can overlook the fact that, like, I use a new framework and I write a couple hundred lines of code, but what does that really represent inside my system? So this is all the stuff that gets brought in. So this is your life now. I like that subtext, right? We have to deal with our real lines of code, working on trying to publish a bill of materials whenever we think about our software. And we're not just looking at application dependencies. Now we've moved the application into the container level and all the other OS dependencies. So it wasn't that long ago when we were dealing with these like OS stuff like shell shock and heartbleed and whatever that really put us in a bind. But tools that you can use for this. So like if you're using like Ruby, there's like bundler audit. OAuth dependency check is a really good one that's free. Of course, there's a ton of paid options, just like SaaS tooling. For JavaScript, retire.js is a great one. And this stat is a little bit old here, but it's not like container security has gotten better, right? But some open source options are like Docker Bench for security, Claire, Falco. There's paid options as well. But the questions we have to look for here as we're approaching our software is like, what have I bundled into my app that's making me vulnerable? And like, what levels above that or below that have been brought into my application? So I think that I'm safe because I'm using this framework, but that's not always the case, and more stuff gets added into my app. And am I shipping a bill of materials with my app? Do I know what is actually getting baked in? What software is actually running in my system? That is a harder one to answer than you would think, but it's a question, it's a thought exercise for you to kind of go through and think about what's the best way we could try to answer that question with the tools we have in place today. Okay, so the build, this is the phase of the system where all the acceptance testing happens, all the previous testing and tooling gets verified here, so everything that was runnable on the developer's laptops obviously gets run again. We have security considerations here where we're doing outside-in security testing. We're even looking at our infrastructure as code testing. We can implement some DAS testing. You may do that more in like your deploy pipeline phase, like that could go in the next box as well. You can start thinking about things like, that sounds really cool and like really nice marketing messages like compliance on every build. But there are people that are doing that. There are people that are kind of going down that pathway. So what are DAST tools? DAST, the whole idea behind this is like on the internet, there are lots of tools that are free that anybody can get. So why shouldn't we just run those against ourselves or pieces of our code base before the attackers do or whatever? And so we started like looking at these different tools and said, oh yeah, that's a good idea. And then we pulled in others as we went through. There's a lot of paid options. You can spend a lot of money in this area. But the goal was that we wanted to come up with a set of automated tests that probe and check security configurations and all the runtime behavior before security features, for security features that will execute every time the system is built and every time the system is deployed. And sometimes you got to wait till that next deployment step, like when you hit the staging or whatever part of your tier. So I helped create this open source project called Gauntlet. There's no E at the end there, but it's a framework for security testing that's written in a natural language. It's written in Gherkin, so developers and security and operations can understand and they can all work together. It wraps security tools, but it's not like a package manager. It doesn't like install the tools for you. You can plug it into your CI/CD pipeline. It's open sourced license. It follows a real like given when then structure. So using a security tool, Arachne, I'm going to look for cross-site scripting and verify that no issues were found. Given this profile, I'm going to go after just the cross-site scripting payloads inside of Arachne and just to a certain part of my app. And that actually runs in seconds instead of minutes or days that you can sometimes have happen with all these other tools. So you break all the pieces down into their smaller parts. Aaron Reinhardt, a friend of mine, he says, he's like, we saved millions of dollars using Gauntlet for the largest healthcare industry project in the world. And I was like, man, I've had United Healthcare before. It was a bad experience. So anyways, I have a whole course. If you have LinkedIn Learning access, you can get the whole course on security testing with Gauntlet, where it's about an hour and a half. We walk through a bunch of examples on how to do that. And if you have questions on that, I'd be happy to help. And so there's some infrastructure and compliance pieces as well. So you can do Test Kitchen, or InSpec is a really nice thing from Chef. But the questions I want to ask is like, am I testing for security low-hanging fruit? Like it's like a low bar to just pick up any attack tool on the internet and run it against your site and check for cross-site scripting, SQL injection, or any of those types of things, right? And then am I arming my pipeline with attack tools so that I can exercise my application in a meaningful way? And have I validated the previous two phases? So now I kind of have a build artifact, I have a hash that I know how to deploy. So, okay, this is where we move from testing, and now we start putting in where customers can actually use it. And so this one sells a lot of copies. So I think as we watch out like our security considerations here inside of the deploy piece, we got to watch out for compliance. We need to think of infrastructure as code. We need deploy accountability as we're moving across. I thought it was funny that Jez and Dave were saying that they wish they did more security. My last job, I was at Signal Sciences, and we were like, hey, we're a security company, we're going to deploy a lot. And I was like, okay, great. And they're like, you're going to do that in like 3 weeks' time at our next all hands. Like, you're going to show our deployment system. And I was like, oh, that's weird. Like, I hadn't talked about that before. So I, looked at my shelf. I was like, oh, there's that book. I like that book. And I was like, I'm going to read that book, a lot right now. And so I got a lot of great ideas from that moment. And we built our own deployment button so that we could escort our software out to production quite easily. We spent a lot of time on it, and we ended up being really successful. In like about a 2.5-year time frame, we had over 10,000 deploys. And it's like a small team, and the company's like 150 people right now. So these stats are a little outdated, but we started realizing one of the principles in that book is like it's how little you can deploy at any one time. And we started thinking, we should really optimize for total cycle time. And so we would often like haul everybody into the room and say, okay, the build's too long. Security tests need to, run parallel, or like we need to do things differently than we are now. But over time, like we got it to where we didn't have to trust. And I think this is like the goal for everybody. Is like we're thinking that deploys can be these standard or routine changes, and they're not this heavyweight change management process. Let's see, we have 7 minutes. Okay, so let me think about where we'll go. Separation of duties. It's harmful. It's bad. But everybody will tell you that you need it, and that'll be your first objection from any auditors that you experience if they haven't had previous experience with this. Here's a list of things if you are find yourself in this position and you need some ammo to defend yourself against the auditors. There's also a project that we worked on called Dear Auditor. Dear Auditor is a love letter from DevOps to audit, and it says, we promise in the future we will bring you along. We will be fully transparent in our development process. We do realize that we're owning the risks, and we'll maintain an open channel. We'll bring you along for the project. So it's an open source project. If you're interested, there's a DevOps controls matrix in there, risk controls matrix in there as well. And I think that it's cool. But the thing I've seen is like auditors will play ball with it once they actually figure out what's going on. It's just at first they've been kind of trained separation of duties type language, which hasn't been working very well over the years anyways. So we got to look at our cloud config, but I think the questions we want to ask at this point is like, what secrets are needed to move my application from development into production? Am I testing for compliance on every deploy? Do I have some way to assert that? And do I have a repeatable mechanism where I'm able to push things into production and where I can prove that out, hopefully with hashes along the way? So the last piece is the operations piece. And so this is the runtime state of our application. This is where our application really lives in production. And so, oh, let's see, there it goes, yeah. So it's kind of like that on a regular basis. But security in the operate phase is only successful if we're creating feedback and learning for developers. And I think that's a key metric for us to think of, like, what's successful in that standpoint. So security considerations in the operations phase. There's security chaos engineering. We're able to create stability through instability, which is this weird thing, but it's actually been proven out that you can get learnings out of your system. Nygaard talks about circuit breakers and bulkheads. I found that to be really helpful in our system. Thinking about application security, abuse and misuse. And I'll get through the rest too as we kind of go through it. But we will. Sometimes we focus on different parts of application security in our application, but we start thinking about what actually matters. Like, we can kind of geek out on, like, the SQL injections or the cross-site scriptings or whatever, but what about, like, account takeover attempts? Or do we know, like, today, like, what areas of our site are more under attack or less under attack, or most likely vectors of attack? Shannon Leitz has done some great research on, like, the types of adversaries and the types of things that they're going after. I find that to be really helpful. Able to get signals out of our application, like abuse and misuse. If you're building, like, a serverless app, Amazon has this here's how to build your own kind of WAF-like product, or WAF, I guess, for serverless. And you can see there's still a bit of places where you're still, like, writing quite a bit of your own code in here, but you're looking for, like, bad bots. You're also looking for OWASP top 10 things. You're looking at bad IP reputation lists. So this sort of starts to, like, cobble all that together, and it gets it where everybody has to have these kind of tools in place. It kind of goes to one of those first slides. It's like even the laggards still had all the technology in place. It's just how you do it, how you put it in your system. But as you're doing runtime defense, you can roll your own, which is kind of like the previous slide, or there's a lot of other examples of that. Or there's some paid options. One pro tip is don't put your AppSec defense at the CDN layer. I won't say more on that, but the cache is not where you defend your application. Red Team Mondays. Shannon Leitz does this over at Intuit. Intuit's a big company. Other big companies could do this too, right? Where on Monday it's like, hey, hackers. She has a group of her team. Like, go, do some penetration testing or whatever it is on anything inside of our system, and then pull this out. She first started it. She got some pushback. Later on, she started having developers and teams say, hey, can you put me on the list for Red Team Mondays? And so it was like a cultural change that started to happen. It's not like those people weren't already in the organization. It's that they weren't already testing. It's just changed the cadence to a predictable time, and people got interested in it. You can do bug bounties too. I think those are hit or miss. Does anybody have bug bounty programs right now? Yeah, about half the room. You get some like them, some don't. But there's a lot of learning that you can get out of those as well. The last piece is security chaos engineering. I was hoping this one would be funnier. Okay, good. Our systems look weird now, right? Like the 3-tiered application, it's hard for me to see my tiers anymore. And I don't feel as comfortable with that. And I don't really know, like, the complexity has grown so much that it's like, I can't really be sure about what it is that I'm testing, and there needs to be another way. And we see this chaos engineering kind of bubbling up, and it's continued to grow over time. But security chaos engineering has been interesting as well, because we're saying we can. I'll read the definition here. It's the identification of security control failures through proactive experimentation to build confidence in their system's ability to defend against malicious conditions in production. And we walk through many, like the principles of chaos.org. We walk through the security steps. So it's like we're defining expected behavior of a security defense. We're hypothesizing that when we introduce some turbulence in there, that it's going to be prevented or remediated or detected. And then we're going to introduce a variable that introduces that security turbulence. And then we try to disprove our hypothesis. Very much like chaos engineering, but now we're creating a learning inside of our environment that's providing that feedback to everyone else. So I really recommend to security folks all the time, and a lot of people in this room probably are familiar with this book, but Release It's a really, really great. And the second edition has really good intro chapters on chaos engineering, along with all the patterns like bulkheads and circuit breakers. So we want to be able to ask questions in operated phase of, do you know if you're under attack right at this current moment? What are the attackers going after? And can I turn on and off services independently if I'm being attacked? Can I use kind of the circuit breaker pattern or bulkheads or kind of control blast radius? And are we doing security chaos experiments? So I think I'm good on time. And so if you want those slides, you can hit that. And yeah, I guess now it's time for the next piece. Or Ken will take my mic. So thanks all.
Thanks. So the first overall question is, the first overall question is basically about here we go. What challenges are you facing in this area? So what kind of things would people, are people kind of wondering about or have experience that they'd like to maybe get advice from other folks on?
Sure. So how do you actually get people's mindsets to change, developer-wise, on actually wanting to move this stuff, shift this stuff to the left and actually get actively involved in testing versus just being a passive receiver of dumps of PDF files?
So anybody can have a response to that? I don't know. We're kind of like looking at James just because he's been talking about it. But
I might have a response.
awesome! Please.
I think this goes back to culture. You have to start with the people that are the early adopters. A really great book called Effective DevOps, and it's really good about identifying who would adopt, and you pull those people in, and then you get momentum, and you advocate, and you DevRel for it, and you do all that stuff. I think it works really well.
Okay. Yeah. So there's a couple ways that people will do this. You can run an internal capture the flag type of scenario or some sort of other security thing that kind of finds sort of creating that security ambassador or security champion inside of all the other teams, because we can't hire out of this problem, right? We can't get enough security people, in the market to be able to fill all the demand that's needed. So we need to find kind of the same model where we're able to bring the champions involved. And so people who do well in that, or just express any interest at all, really, those are ones that would kind of you would want to bring into security program.
Well, actually, question or follow-up?
Can I answer? Hi, and I want to say, so Microsoft we have red teams in various, parts of the organization, and people volunteer to be on the red team, and that's the most popular thing ever because everyone wants to be a part of the red team. So that's one way to get folks involved in the security efforts.
Can you follow up? Sure.
All right. I'm actually going to phrase this both as a question and as an answer. I think that what you appreciate appreciates, what you reward increases, and I'm really interested in how people think about measuring in meaningful ways. You can talk about we're going to be more secure, we're going to do better practice and so forth, but if you start creating goals, signals, metrics, and actually are able to articulate how the work we've done has improved the state of our world, and you can continuously measure it, then it's much easier to get people to notice the impact they're doing. Otherwise, come and do all this great stuff, and it's either a bottomless pit of problems we haven't solved yet, or nobody realizes the ROI at the end of the day. And so I'm super interested in how people think about and measure continuously any kind of effort they're doing in the Java space, whether it's security or otherwise.
Happy to continue that conversation, but David here has been waiting patiently to ask a question as well, so let's keep the ball rolling.
Sweet. Thank you. So I had a question about balance. So one of the things that I've noticed that it seems to be kind of difficult for people to balance is automatically deploying software fixes. So you mentioned Docker. So if your base image changes and you want to automatically deploy updates to that versus sort of being too speedy. So anytime any of your dependencies changing, automatically merging that in and deploying it. So do you find a balance between very eagerly updating all of your dependencies as soon as possible and deploying, or having a more manual approach that might be slower? And so,
Balance and monitoring. Thoughts?
So I'll have I guess an opinion on that. So I don't think it's a question between the kind of automated or the manual. It's I guess more the kind of the process. So I think what I've found is frequently doing updates. And as long as you have a pipeline and you're able to kind of test and make sure that we're confident, okay, we've downloaded all the latest patches, and dependencies, and we're going to push it through the pipeline, and we're pretty confident we're going to catch it. I kind of prefer to do that, so we have a frequent cadence. And then if we find there's particular things that are kind of troublesome, then we might kind of like pin those and treat those a little bit more specially. I don't know if other people have different experiences of managing that.
Okay, next round of questions was, what challenges have you been successful fighting in this space? Any success stories?
I turned on guard duty one time in my last job, and within 20 minutes, we found that we were mining Monero on an old machine.
And how much did you make off that?
0.
Other success stories? Have these practices been really helpful?
I'm going to go to the red teaming story again. So when we first started doing this, people would break into our software really, really quickly, like literally within like hours. And it's been getting progressively more complex to break in. And so this has been a very good experience.
Very nice. Any estimate on time, like order of magnitude, or?
So right now, like we've moved to the place where like you have to have insider knowledge or some real skills, and spend some time trying to infiltrate to be able to. And it's still the red team always wins. It's
Just a matter of time, as long as that's increasing.
That sounds to me like an interesting case of because there was a question earlier about how do you measure, right? Because I think measurement for security is often a binary, like we got hacked or we didn't, in a bad way. So being able to measure, it takes this long for a red team to kind of have some kind of success is maybe a metric.
Actually, I like that thought. Can we flip that on its head? What are some better practices, or what are some better questions on measuring and metrics that kind of surface those?
I wanted to talk about this question, I guess. About success stories. I worked at Google for a number of years, and one thing that Google did quite well that I think that could be applied to every other company is to provide a really good developer experience when developing, to provide frameworks and platforms that have really good developer experience and that are uniform and that developers by themselves decide to adopt because it simplifies their life. When you do something like that, you create centralized opportunities for injecting yourself into the development workflow of these developers. So when they're using your framework or when they're using your platform, you have the opportunity of also injecting security best practices in their development workflow. You have the opportunity of injecting, let's say, automatic management of their logging and so forth. So the summary of it is you fight the heterogeneity. What's the word?
Heterogeneity.
You fight the mass by providing a really good user experience and say, hey, here's a much easier way for you to develop code. And they go and do that. And as a side effect, maybe that's not what the developer was looking for, but maybe as a side effect, you can also enforce best practices because everything has been unified in that one way of doing things.
Very nice.
I like that a lot. I like that making the right things easy helps get rid of security problems just because they don't happen. And I think one of the wins that we've had at AWS is sort of by user experience getting rid of certain just vectors completely and just giving it to somebody else. So when we started, we had all these verts and we had to manage operating system patches, runtimes, all of these things, and there's just so many different layers that a lot of our time was mostly devoted to security. But moving to Docker and having to worry just about our base image now instead of having to having someone else manage the operating system for us, it was a UX win. As an engineer, I don't care about which version of Linux I'm using, honestly, but I can focus on containers. And then moving just beyond that, it's okay, well, maybe some people don't have to even worry about containers. They can just bundle their code up and put it into some serverless thing. And these are all super awesome developer wins because we don't have to care about them. But the plus side of me getting to be lazy is that I don't have other people are able to worry about the security who are really, really good at it. So I think that's also sort of a win. A usability and security win kind of go back together.
Very nice.
Can I come in here? So one of the ways we think about metrics and success, I have a thought for you here that maybe see if y'all agree or not. But in performance, like in operations, we try to surface page load times and other things like that, and we were able to expose that, and then we were able to solve the problem. But in a lot of security places, that sort of data is hidden, or security in many places is that data is hidden from folks. Like, who's attacking, what are they attacking, what are they going after, are they successful, that kind of stuff. So the security telemetry is not making it back to developers. And so we can think about metrics, but I also think like just change behaviors in your development and operations team is a really important way to think about it. And it really clicked for me whenever I was talking to an engineering manager, not a security person, engineering manager, and they had some security telemetry and observability type tooling installed. And they told me that they were using that to prioritize work out of their backlog based off of what they saw coming in there. They're like, oh yeah, like our auth page gets hit a lot with like all this cross-site scripting stuff. So like anything, like we draw a circle around that, and as we're like going to the next sprint, like we try to pick stuff out of there. And I don't know, in my wildest dreams, I wouldn't have thought that would have been true about just because like how systemically the problem had been fit with development. But once it was exposed at a layer when someone could see it, they could then fix it. And I thought that was a really cool thing.
Okay, so the third question to kind of throw into the mix is like, if you could wave a magic wand, what would you want to see in the next 2 to 5 years? Like, what would like great look like, or what could we ask from like, say, tool vendors, platform vendors, and those kind of things? What would make this all better?
Andrew, you look like you have a valid comment at this point.
Well, I can try. Maybe Rust being used everywhere, or C++ somehow become safe suddenly. Yeah, but maybe one of those things. I think also there was a really nice slide showing a lot of tools, and like for me this presentation was sort of not necessarily applicable right away. I'm sitting there in the engineering corner, and then there is the corner of all of the security guys, and they just do the right thing, and sometimes they just create a bug on us. Oh, here is a buffer overrun. Go and fix it, and then okay, next month maybe we'll find time to do that. But I'm in this space, but I can see how for maybe smaller companies, applying pages like this, finding the right tool, because nobody else is gonna do it for you, just hackers.
Anyone want to chime in with more? What do we need if we had a magic wand?
I think it's time to start accepting that we should be securing software by default and accepting the pain of it maybe not working when I just run a command. Things like Mongo or Elastic, etc., where it just shows up completely unauthenticated, so we all just run them and then we get hacked and we're like, why? Maybe it's time we move beyond that and be like, well, it's just going to be secure by default, and it's a little bit harder to run the first time, but after you run it a few times, it's no different.
So as I was thinking, like if I had a magic wand, then what would be helpful is to know that predicting logic in processors will be a bad thing. So maybe we shouldn't do it right away. That's one thing. Another, there was an idea here that Docker really helps from the security perspective. But I think if you ask any Googler, they will say no, because I think Google has quarrel with Docker that you shouldn't be root by default. Another problem with Docker is, I don't know, since till certain version, management of Docker would be possible by just connecting to a TCP port that is completely unprotected. So I think that's another thing I would like some magic solution to. There is a bright, shiny thing today, and we all jump on it. Wow, it helps our security, it isolates. But in reality, it has so many flaws that are just yet to be discovered. And there is some guy in China somewhere already inside of your organization because of that.
I think something you said about the secure by default struck a chord with me on, and with a theme with some of the, I think was touched on in the previous talk around security. And it's making the right thing to do the easy thing to do, I think, is the key, right? And so this is like, what I'd like to see in 2 to 5 years is like when you're sitting down to start something or build something, it's not only that like, oh, it's going to be such a pain in, to do it the right way and actually have a password rather than not, but actually it's just easier to do that and it'll be harder to do the wrong thing.
Yeah, so I'll actually take a moment to chime in. I like the security by default, but I got to really ask because I'm not a super Windows admin. I'm more of a Linux guy. But PowerShell, whenever I go to start working with PowerCLI, because I've got a virtual machine, one of the first things I do is turn off, bad me, I'll admit it, right here on stage. I'll turn off the PowerShell built-in protection. So if we're going to pass out the disable instructions and make those freely available, then we're shooting ourselves in the foot, me included. Don't use that one as much. But as far as magic wand and wish list, what I'd really like to see is better security and observability metrics and tooling. Where I work, it's generally, hey, security's coming to talk to me, and I'm sitting down, and they've got a separate report, and then I'll break down. But bringing that into my visibility, into my CI/CD pipeline, and figuring out what good metrics to watch, and just making sure that that conversation's there. And it feels like, yeah, there's monitoring and observability tools that could do that better, but I think it's also just a more general conversation across the board and informing me as a dev or an ops person about better security practices as well and how those things kind of trickle through.
So I just want to kind of build on what you said. If I had a magic wand, the security would be a part of a pipeline and it would be automated, and so it would be integral to delivering software rather than an afterthought.
And that's why we're here. DeliveryConf, now delivering you security.
I think maybe like the removal of the kind of the blame culture that sort of sits in security. That we kind of said it, tongue in cheek at the beginning. It's like CISOs are kind of there, so like when you get hacked, you can fire them. That's a real problem. And if security is not seen on the value side, much kind of like the Jez and Dave's talk earlier, it's like, where security reports, how security is seen in the organization, is it part of our overall mission, part of what we do, or is it like we got breached, we fire that person over there because that's what we do, like when we respond to breach. So
I would love to see product owners thinking about security very early on when they're thinking about the requirements for their products. I think we should be talking to they should be talking to customers more early on and understand their security requirements early on, rather than like engineers and security engineers having to figure out what security standards, what is the bar for security that this particular application should meet. I feel like product owners basically don't think about security at all. They don't interview customers about security. They don't understand what are the vectors or what the customers are or the users, right, are worried about. So it would be nice if the product owners, product managers in general, understood a little bit more about security and thought a little bit more about it.
Very nice. Actually, no further, I'll follow up on this. What are some good ways to have that conversation with managers? Have you seen that done well? Because I imagine if we go talk to our product manager right now, they'll say, yes, give me security. But what does that mean? How do we drive to workful or useful answers in that?
I think that people appreciate training, right? If you offer training, that's one way that you can spread the knowledge. So at Google, there was like the resident hackers training that they would offer for anyone in the engineering or product organizations, where they would understand what are the day-to-day concerns, what is a cross-site like scripting vulnerability, and what is this, what is that. And I think that anyone that works at a cloud vendor here, if you're a customer of a cloud vendor, you should be asking for that cloud vendor or that vendor in general for more questions about security, so that then that passes down the requirements for product managers to think more about it. I think that's one.
Okay, and with that, I think it's time for lunch. So thank you all for coming, and I hope we carry on the conversation. Cheers.
Thank you.